This is my little microphone that I use out in the field, as they say, and it's called a Rode Video Wireless Go mic. I don't know what it's called. I can't really remember, to be honest, but it's got one button on it, as you might be able to see there, just on the bottom, and that button is responsible for turning it on and off. Guess which button I forgot to press yesterday? I spent quite a long time rambling on yesterday and got home to realise that you wouldn't be able to hear any of it. I think at one point I was even talking about the joys of dangling your legs like a 5-year-old when your feet aren't touching the ground. Right, so today what I thought I'd do is talk a little bit about this, which I think is the most controversial lens in photography. Not this exact lens, this lens type, a standard zoom. Now, to be honest, I think largely lenses are considered about as controversial as potatoes. That is to say, not controversial at all. Particularly this kind of lens, you know, a lens that's called a standard zoom. I mean, the word standard sort of implies that it's not controversial, but stick with me. So yes, this is a 12-35 f2.8 lens from Lumix. I've used it for 2 or 3 years now, and in many regards, it's pretty much as standard as you can get. This is the equivalent of a 24-70 lens if you've got a full frame camera, or probably something like an 18-55 if you shoot APS-C. And the term standard comes from the fact that it covers pretty much all the standard focal lengths, what are considered the standard focal lengths. So 24, 35, 50, all those focal lengths can be achieved with this lens in full frame equivalent. And as a result, lots of photographers, both amateur and professional, consider this kind of lens to be their absolute workhorse, the lens that stays on their camera the majority of the time. And in fact, I've done jobs in the past that I couldn't have done without this kind of lens, because if I'd used primes, for example, if I'd have had a 24, a 35, a 50, an 85, which isn't covered in this lens, but let's just say it is for the sake of argument, if I'd have had one of those lenses each and a body for each of those lenses, just to speed things up, it would still be slower to switch between bodies for photos than it would to just zoom a little bit between each shot. And that, in a dynamic shoot, or if you're working on something that requires lots of different photos very quickly in small amounts of time at different focal lengths, that can mean that you're missing shots if you're using primes and you don't happen to have an assistant with you. So there's a reason that these lenses are so popular and considered workhorses by so many people. However, they are a little bit boring. So yes, they can shoot at lots of the standard focal lengths, in many cases with fantastic image quality and with fairly bright apertures. I mean, this has got a maximum aperture of f2.8 right the way through the zoom range, and that is fairly common among standard zooms. So this is my old standard zoom. This is a Tamron 24-70. I've owned this lens for about 6 years. I've only had a camera that it fits on for about half of that. I don't know why I've still got it, I need to sell it. Some of the lenses have variable apertures, so at the wide end they'll be quite bright, and then at the long end they'll be slightly less bright. I can't see one, I've got a couple, but it doesn't matter, you know what I'm talking about. But for the most part, these lenses are very capable at lots of different focal lengths, which is why people like them. They produce great image quality, in many cases with very limited distortion, very limited chromatic aberration, all that kind of stuff. They perform very well. However, I'd liken it to off-roading, or wanting to go off-roading and then choosing to go in a helicopter. I mean, if you're going to go off-roading, the reason you want to go off-roading is for the challenge, really, and to feel the bumps in the road and to feel the excitement of that. If you go in a helicopter, you're not going to feel any of that, because a helicopter is too capable. It'll just kind of float over the bumps, unless there's something seriously wrong with the helicopter. And it's much the same when it comes to shooting on a standard zoom versus primes. Whenever I shoot with primes, and this is a very good one, this is a 15mm Lumix Leica f1.7 lens. I love to use it as much as I possibly can. I feel much more connected to the images that I create with this at 15mm than I do with this at 15mm. And that's just because in many cases I got to work a lot harder to get a composition I'm happy with this lens versus with a zoom lens for fairly obvious reasons. I have to walk around with this lens to get the kind of photo I want. And a lot of the time that involves risk because I could miss shots because I'm not able to zoom and work as quickly as I would be able to with a zoom. But just as if I was to go off-roading in an off-roading vehicle versus going in a helicopter, I feel much more engaged in the process using a prime than I do a zoom. And ultimately what that means is that I enjoy using this more. It's a bit more of a challenge. I'm a bit more involved in the process. I feel a bit prouder of the photos I create with it because it's often harder work. And therefore, you could argue that it's better for my photography. Might not be the same for everyone. That's how I feel. And the reason I'm talking about this is because I get asked about it all the time. Should I get a standard zoom? Should I shoot with primes? And I've talked about zooms versus primes on this channel before, but this is something that I grapple with all the time. And yeah, I know I'm not the only one. So to everyone who asks what I think they should do, should they get a standard zoom or should they get primes? It's a very, very difficult question to answer. What I would say is that if you can afford to shoot with primes, shoot with primes. And when I say afford, I don't just mean financially. I mean, sometimes it's cheaper to use a zoom, sometimes it's cheaper to use primes. It's more expensive to use primes usually because you have to buy a few of them. And in total, that often costs more than the cost of one zoom. But you probably know that. No, what I mean by afford is if you can justify the fact that you're probably going to miss shots if you're using primes, you're going to have to be changing lenses an awful lot more, obviously, than if you're using zooms. And that can lead to frustration, it can lead to missed shots, it can lead to not being as happy with your photography because you've not got as many shots. If you're okay with that, then I think, in my experience, in the people that I talk to, and in my personal experience, you'll have more fun and you'll feel more engaged in your photography if you're using primes. If, however, you're interested in trying to shoot for a living, if that's going to involve lots of very dynamic work environments, then I think it's probably safest to end up with a 24-70, which this isn't. It's a 12-35, but you know what I mean. But if you're not working on fast-paced photo shoots, if the world won't fall down just because you miss a couple of shots every time you're changing lenses or getting the other body out that you might have for another lens, I just think primes are awesome. And I really want to get into using them more. And for my personal photography, I think I'm slowly getting to a point where I might be able to do that because I've noticed over the past, I don't know, year, 18 months or so, that my photos typically now are shot somewhere between 24mm and 35mm, typically fairly close to those two, which means that if I could end up with a couple of primes that did that, well, that would probably be all right for me most of the time. What else? There are some other considerations. Weight, for example. As you know, I talk a lot about weight. Weight is quite important to me because I'm the sort of person that likes to climb mountains and stuff to take photos. And that being the case, I think often using a zoom is the way to go, purely because zooms are often a lot lighter than primes. I mean, not on their own. Clearly, in this case, the prime is smaller and lighter. But if you've got 2, 3, 4 primes, then that weight can add up. Also, Micro Four Thirds is not a good demonstration of this because obviously this prime is tiny. In fact, all the primes I've got are tiny. Look, this is a 20mm that I used the other week for that video I was walking around Bakewell. It's tiny as well. Slightly better demonstration. Here's a 25 versus a 12-35. It's 1.4 this, slightly bigger. You get the idea. If you're shooting with 2, 3, 4, 5 primes maybe versus one of these, it's going to be a bit more, well, it's going to be heavier. So zoom is good for being light. However, a zoom is only good really when it's light. So in low light, typically it's much better to be using primes because often primes are much faster, particularly the bigger primes. That said, if you're climbing up mountains to shoot in the dark, well, you'll need a gym membership because you're going to end up needing primes for the maximum apertures. I hope I've cleared that up for you. I probably haven't. What I'd say is this: anything that you buy when it comes to photography, cameras, lenses, any equipment at all, is by definition flawed. for some people. And you've got to decide what flaws you're happy to settle with. Are you happy, for instance, to shoot with primes because it's a much more enjoyable experience? And is that more important to you than the hassle of having to change lenses and the hassle of the fact that your kit altogether is probably going to be a bit heavier? Likewise, are you happy to miss out on some of the magic that lots of photographers, including me, feel when we use primes for the convenience of having a zoom? And only you can really decide that. But yeah, my thought process is that because I'm lucky enough at the moment that I don't have to do loads of commercial jobs where I would really need the benefits of a standard zoom, that means that I get to shoot with primes. And that is something that I'm quite keen to act on, I would say. And so that, in short, is why this very uncontroversial lens is controversial, in my opinion. A standard zoom, the most controversial lens in photography. Thank you very much for watching, and thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. Skillshare has been a sponsor of mine for a little while now, and I'm absolutely loving taking their classes. I'm taking one at the moment from Jeff Staple, all about branding. And I mean, let's be honest, I'm not going to set up a fashion label anytime soon. Look at me. But there are so many crossover skills that you learn in these classes that I really enjoy watching all kinds of different things. And on Skillshare, you will find classes in pretty much everything. So crafts, photography, videography, UX design, music production, all kinds of different stuff is available on Skillshare, all for less than $10 a month. And if you click the link in the description, if you're one of the first 1,000 of my subscribers to do so, you'll get 2 months free as well. So a big thank you to Skillshare for that. If you've got any suggestions on Skillshare classes that I should take after I've finished learning about branding, I'd love to know. Anything but bungee jumping. For me, not particularly interested in learning about that. So thank you very much for watching. Please like and subscribe if you haven't before. Liking these videos really helps the channel, as does subscribing, to be honest. I'd really appreciate that. And I'll see you next week when hopefully we'll be back outside. And hopefully I remember to turn my microphone on.